So thank you all for joining us today for Backyard Insect Finds, Great Discoveries in Nature, brought to you by the Vermont Entomology Academy. My name is Bernie Paquette. Most of the insects shown in this montage were photographed not in a rainforest, not in a national park, but in our 1-acre yard. Most of us walk past extraordinary life every day without noticing them. And by the way, on one of the bug safaris that I mentioned earlier, the owner who invited us over to their yard, this one particular owner, asked us, what are bugs good for anyway? Anyone care to suggest some things that they're good for?
Pollination.
Excellent, thank you. That comes to top of mind. Good. So we know the fate of the world's insects is inseparable from our own. They provide nutrient cycling, biological pest control, food for wildlife, pollination, flowering plants and crops, water filtration, plant seed dispersal, decomposition, breaking down of organic matter, and they aid in soil health. Tonight, I want to show you what becomes visible when we start to look closely and introduce you to an activity that I've coined as inverting, the joy of observing invertebrates. Part adventure, part treasure hunt, part safari. E.O. Wilson said, the diversity of life forms so numerous that we have yet to identify most of them is the greatest wonder on this planet. So who am I and why do I spend so much time observing insects? Well, I'm a citizen scientist who promotes curiosity, observation, and reflection about all forms of life in nature. I've developed programs like Jericho Families in Nature, Backyard Bug Safaris, and the Vermont Entomology Academy, including a week-long Bug Huggers Adventure Camp. I also post observations on iNaturalist, about 30,000 so far, and write nature-themed stories and comics. But what matters most is not who I am, it's what you can see. Tonight, I'll show you a small sampling of insects I've observed nearby over the past 6 years. You'll see predation, copulation, birth, nature's art, and some truly surprising behaviors. So where do you go for this kind of adventure? Closer than you might think. Let me show you what I mean. Why is animism, the attribution of soul to animals, lost to all but the youngest children? How is it that we don't see the extent and vitality of the life that's entangled with our own? I titled this one, Wolfhound.
What is it really, Bernie?
I forget if it's a butterfly or a moth.
Oh, it definitely looks like a wolfhound.
I'm going blank, but one of the two. I've penned this horsefly with the title Arrow Eye. Horseflies know which way to the good stuff. Their eyes literally point the way. On the left, mama releases her eggs. On the right, the hummingbird clearwing moth reaches for buttonbush food. Scenes like this happen every day in every yard practically. We just don't usually slow down enough to see them. What makes this especially remarkable is that most of the diversity is not far away. It's right outside our doors. When you look closely enough, a patch of wildflowers becomes a landscape, and a garden becomes a wilderness. And the diversity in that wilderness is astonishing. This is Jimmy Durante, also known as the American snout butterfly. Jimmy landed on my hand at Mob's near the entrance and stayed there while I walked up the 150 steps up the trail until I reached the parking lot. These have not seen too often, at least not on iNaturalist. That was quite a surprise for me. She is strutting her stuff. What a beauty this American lady is. Last September, I spent several days looking for butterflies at Mob's in support of Vermont Center for EcoStudies' Vermont Butterfly Atlas. Earlier visits to Mob's had offered sightings of several butterfly species, but only a handful of monarchs. That changed on September 9th and 10th. On those 2 days, the fields were alive with them. A migratory feeding frenzy. A kaleidoscope in motion. On the second day, there were so many that it felt like they would literally lift me off the ground. I imagined them lifting me to carry me home, but worried they might drop me off in central Mexico. After photographing and counting 75 individual monarchs in just 2 days, I found myself even more invested in their survival. These gentle creatures, so often symbols of transformation, remind us of the fragile beauty in our world and how important it is to pay attention and to participate and to care. I love freckles. Just ask Mav. This is a species of marsh fly that is often referred to as a snail-eating fly. Who knew bees have 5 eyes? The 3 small eyes called ocelli. Did I get that right? Thank you. On top of the head, sense light intensity and polarized light for flight, stabilization, and navigation. By a show of hands, since Spencer hasn't pitched yet, I'll see how many people. How many knew that there were over 350 wild bee species in Vermont? Couple, 3, great. Half a dozen people, excellent. Excellent, I'm impressed. A few years ago when I started taking pictures of insects, I didn't think there were more than 8 or 10. As you watch these slides, I want you to keep 2 numbers in mind. How many bee species and how many total insect species might live in a single 1-acre yard? To understand why those numbers matter, we need to start with caterpillars. Caterpillars play a critical role in ecosystems. They transfer more energy from plants to other animals than any other plant eater type, any other plant eater insect. Entomologist Doug Tallamy estimates that it takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise a single clutch of chickadees. Birds raising a family essentially ask one question: where's the beef? And in ecological terms, the beef is caterpillars. What bird could resist this beauty on its plate? Me? I just wanted to rub its belly and see if all its legs would shimmy about in glee. To make our yard a pollinator and bird sanctuary, we've been steadily increasing the percentage of native plants, especially shrubs and trees. As an example, if you want to attract Luna moths, you might want to plant hickory trees, as the Luna caterpillars eat hickory leaves and pupate in the leaf litter. So leave the leaves on the ground in the fall as well. We aim to attract a diverse mix of insects, which helps maintain ecological balance. That balance, in turn, helps our vegetable gardens and fruit plantings flourish. Last summer, wasps, or yellow jackets, built a nest under one of our raised beds in our vegetable garden. That was not especially convenient for us. Mav is allergic to their stings. However, we managed not to alarm them while gardening our vegetable beds through the summer, and determined that they may have been responsible for drastically reducing the garden pest that we've experienced in the past years. One of the biggest threats to wildlife is habitat loss. The foundation of life cannot be supported by the ecological deserts of lawns that have replaced much of our vibrant ecosystems. We can reinscribe complexity, meaning reestablishing or bringing back intricate, multifaceted, and diverse landscapes. We can view them in a new context and strengthen their influence. Complexity, which might have been overlooked, can be written back into our narrative, our framework, and our cultural norms. Worldwide biodiversity loss can feel overwhelming. But there's one place where we can make a real, visible difference: the land where we live. And we can often see the results surprisingly quickly. Recently, we've focused on plants that provide pollen for specialist bees, species that depend on just one or a few types of flowers. For example, after planting clammy ground cherry, we quickly attracted this broad-footed cellophane bee. Last year, we obtained several sandbar willow plants from Spencer at the Farm Upstream. I'm hoping to observe the sandbar willow fairy bee, a specialist bee in Vermont that feeds exclusively on the sandbar willow pollen during June and July. We've also purchased native perennials from Toby at Bird and Bees Native Plants, as well as bare root trees and shrubs through Winooski Natural Conservation District annual tree and shrub sale. If you want to see more insects and pollinators, the answer isn't to travel farther, it's to have a diversity of local plants nearby. We limit lawn and mowing to pathways and small sitting areas. We create brush and wood piles, and I've built many critter houses, both above and below ground. We leave plant stems, dead snags, and leaves to make the yard more hospitable for insects, birds, and other wildlife. And then we sit back and watch life happen. Wildlife raising families, feeding, reproducing, and interacting in countless ways. Some people describe our yard as messy. Some call it wild. Others see it as natural. I see it as alive, calming, nearly work-free. That's a big one for me. And full of diverse species, both plants and animals. A few years back, I spent about 3 hours each day over 3 days watching insects at this critter house. Think of it as an insect apartment house. One resident was a leafcutter bee, delivering carefully cut leaf pieces and food to create pollen loaves for each egg. Its round trip times were about 2 to 5 minutes apart. Which reminds me, you notice the leaves on the right? When I see leaves with holes or chew marks, I feel delighted. And people say, why? After all that work of planting them. Because it means that our plants are supporting the web of life. Unlike non-native honeybees, nearly all Vermont wild bees are solitary. Each female constructs and provisions her own nest, placing a pollen ball and a single egg in each chamber before sealing it. The species uses cuttings to wallpaper each cradle. This was the 98th bee species I observed in Vermont, found at Saxon Hill in Essex, an area with sandy soils and excellent wildlife habitat, but also under great development pressure. Protecting habitat like this area is critical for wildlife and for humans. A bird watcher can often find all the bird species that there are in Vermont within a few years. An inverter is unlikely to see every insect species in a lifetime. That means that there's tremendous opportunity for insect great finds. In 2021, I photographed a tiny bee on a mock orange flower and posted it on iNaturalist. Spencer took a close look and suspected it might be a new species record for Vermont. Later confirmed as the mock orange scissor bee. Kent McFarland of the Vermont Center for EcoStudies responded to this posting on iNaturalist. Very cool. Hard to say if these are rare or rarely reported, but for now, you get the crown for the first Vermont record. That was a good day. I'll show you a few additional examples of species that were rarely reported or unexpected or first records in Vermont. These discoveries remind us how much remains to be learned and discovered, even in familiar places. The image on the left, observed in our yard, is the first of this species to be reported on iNaturalist in Vermont, with only 3 others posted in New England. The insect on the right was the 5th observation of this species in Vermont. This species is a family of stalk-eyed flies. The observation was the first and is still the only one posted on iNaturalist for Vermont. There are none in New Hampshire, Connecticut, or Maine on iNaturalist, and only 2 both New York and Massachusetts. I observed this ant on a willow, a first on iNaturalist in Vermont as well, also known as the Valentine ant, based on the shape of its gaster or its abdomen. I'll struggle with this one, but the Latin name is Populus duzui. Sorry, killed that one, I'm sure. It's the first reported on iNaturalist for the entire United States. That was a good day. They're all good days with the insects. Finding the insects is only part of the story. Watching what they do is even more fascinating. Dragonflies are super fast flyers. I'm talking 35, 40 miles an hour. Sometimes they land on me and use me as a dinner table while they munch lunch. However, this picturesque beauty seemed to be camera shy. After many sessions of catch me if you can, as I chased it around, this dragonfly posed on the grass stalk on the left while I took the shot. This photo. In the photo on the right, the dragonfly then stood straight up, waving in the breeze like a baseball pennant, as if to say, if you're going to chase me all over Eden, then at least capture my full and gorgeous self. What a talented beauty indeed. If this were the Insect Olympics, I think I'd give this meadowhawk a score of at least 8 for the handstand, especially the far right picture.
Well, he has lots of hands. It makes it easier.
True. Was the wasp on the left happy to see me? Or was it calculating how many meals it could make out of me? I've observed insects feeding at goldenrods where a wasp will come in at rocket speed right by my shoulder, fly over and snatch one of them. So don't let the smile fool you. The image of the individual portrait on the right was relatively easy to capture since the rest of the body was missing. That was unusual. This fly's name means antenna foot. They frequently hold their white-tipped front legs up and wave them around in a manner that makes them look like the antenna of a wasp. I think this one was doing some sort of aerobic exercise. Note the hitchhiker underneath the fly, especially the top right picture, you can see it pretty well. It's from a family of pseudoscorpions, which are small scorpion-like arachnids. They're beneficial to humans since they prey on carpet beetle larvae, book lice, ants, mites, and small flies. As it often happens, I didn't see all there was to see in the field when I took the photo, but only discovered the hitchhiker when I examined and cropped and blew up the photo. Flies often get a bad rap, yet they are the most complex, crucial, and highly adaptive creatures on the earth. I titled this photo, Fly by Night. Perhaps this individual, seemingly wearing a vest, sought out the perfume of the rose for its hot date. The eastern phantom crane fly flies upright with its legs spread apart below. They seem to float in the air like a tuft or a tail of a milkweed seed or maybe a paratrooper. Now, not all behavior is dramatic. Some of it is simply surprising or amusing. And sometimes insects remind us not to take ourselves too seriously. In May, the highlight of my day was observing a dragonfly from about a foot away, it was on the ground, and watching its abdomen. Well, this was a dragonfly. I'll get to the grasshopper in a minute. And I watched its abdomen throb, bend, extend, and then voila, it pooped. This grasshopper sequence happened later in the summer, over about maybe 15 seconds in time. Look closely at the abdomen end. Oops. This, right. See the deposit on the ground on the lower left? Sort of looks like a gherkin pickle, though not at all that appetizing. I love it when shit happens in our yard. Finding insects is only part of the story. Watching what they do is even more fascinating. As you'll see in the next sequence, the world of insects includes predation, a constant struggle to survive, and sometimes inquisitiveness. Who's eating who in this photo?
Who was? Did you figure it out, Bernie?
I can only guess. I think the insect on the bottom was playing possum, but it was definitely not out of danger. As I stood very close to this diner, I swear I could hear the chewing. And this one is, but particularly ones with more wings, I've seen discarded parts that kind of drift off in the breeze as it eats its prey. This dragonfly was using a dried plant stem to floss after lunch. On the right, the green bee is not happy to have met up with the robber fly. Note the spotted eyes on the two bees on the left. This bee seems to be cornered, but I wouldn't count him out yet. Remember the famous Muhammad Ali quote? Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. The hands can't hit what the eyes can't see. The image on the upper left shows that, upper right, sorry, shows that the moth escaped birds and bats, but it probably was not a good idea to invite ants over for lunch, as the moth turned out to be lunch. The beetle on the left skewered a caterpillar for lunch. Looks something like a shish kebab. I remember offering the beetle to pass it the ketchup, but the bottle of ketchup, but the beetle declined. The lady beetle on the bottom right is feeding on one of its favorite foods, aphids. I suspect they taste like lemon gumdrops, but I decided not to try out. Insects are part of a larger web of life that includes amphibians, birds, mammals, and plants. Everything connects. These New York carpenter ants are not eating the woolly aphids. They're farming them or milking them for sweet desserts. I'm overjoyed when I get to meet insect neighbors up front and personal, especially when they reach out to me for first contact by landing on me. Welcome aboard, Meadowhawk. When we start seeing insects as living creatures, obscured by their small size, but enlarged by their beauty, abilities, and everyday family life, then these connections with nature spark our curiosity and form bonds. This pair on the top right remained on my hand at Mobs for over 24 minutes as I walked the trails and took photos of other insects. Observation with an openness, an empathy is necessary for our attention to matter. Hoverflies are acrobatic, artful, and a joy to watch. Occasionally, an individual with apparently lots of free time will hover close to my face, observing me. Unlike the hoverflies, bumblebees have no time for my foolishness. Often one will lift a leg to say that I'm interrupting her efforts at a flower. If she lifts two legs, then I know that I'm greatly disturbing this hard-working creature. One time, one individual rolled onto its back and shimmied, indicating that he felt even further stress. If I persist, the bumblebee will fly away to another flower, no doubt cursing me as it goes. I imagine the bumblebee thinking, "Can a guy eat in peace?" Ah, now that had to hurt. Now we come to one of the most common, often overlooked behaviors in nature: reproduction. Insects don't hide it. They conduct much of their lives in the open, often in plain sight. Do insects blush? Well, they sure have reasons to. The place where many of them make more insects is outside. Yep, in the park, by your favorite trail, in fields of tall grasses, on trees, on shrubs, on flowers. Heck, almost any time it's above 60 degrees, you can probably find a pair of hugging insects in your yard. And you can view some of the romantic observations here tonight, as well as go outside in the spring and summer and see them in real life. As far as I know, they don't blush much. The image on the left is a field mark for the rapture moment. Their tips turn silver. Well, so I imagine anyway. Two's company, three's a crowd. Mav coined this one a pair of three. Wing to wing, a friendship becomes a flirtation, which becomes pure bliss and brings on a family. Spooning, or just plain cuddling, are both adorably comforting, even for slugs. Both Mav and I agree there is nothing like a hug to say, I love you. What a great way to say, I love you on St. Paddy's Day. And eco-friendly, too. These two appear to be head over heels in love. I imagine she's saying, well, hugs are always good. And he says, well, how about a piggyback ride?
I love the name of this book, Bug, Jagged Ambush Bug. I mean, that is just a miracle.
And sometimes insects getting together is just darn extra cute. I do wonder who designed the hat. The challenge these two are having is keeping the stripes lined up. Matching couples' pajamas. Couple boudoir photography is a photographic style featuring intimate, romantic, and sometimes sensual images of couples in love. Insects are romantic. They put their hearts into it. Beyond behavior, insects offer something else. Beauty, design, living art. Sometimes the reward of inverting is simply seeing something extraordinary or beautiful. The diffused image in the fern add a soft, calming feeling to this photo. The harvester butterfly is the only carnivorous or insectivorous butterfly in North America. The larvae feed on various aphids. Even ants are a thing of beauty. I recommend the book titled Ant Hill by E.O. Wilson. It's an engaging novel that brings you deep into the very social world of ants. Oh my, Grandma, what big eyes you have. Observation is a skill that develops with practice. The more closely we look, the more we notice. And the more we notice, the more we appreciate. All forms in nature likely serve a purpose for the species that evolved the way it did. Still, viewing the spotted longhorn beetle, I cannot imagine eating while having a mustache that long. Asian beetles are considered a true pest. On the other hand, native lady beetles are considered highly beneficial. They don't bite, and they consume several harmful garden pests, including aphids. On the far right, by the way, there's an Asian lady beetle nymph. So you can see third down, I think, on the far right. 36 native lady beetle species have been historically documented in Vermont. Unfortunately, 12 of those species have not been seen since the 1970s. E.O. Wilson said, "Unless humanity learns a great deal more about global biodiversity and moves quickly to protect it, we will soon lose most of the species composing of life on Earth." When I look closely into the eyes of a dragonfly, I think they see and understand more of me than I do of them. They seem to be telling me if only humans could talk, then we could see eye to eye. I find the pastel colors of this image pleasing. The flower is torched with radiating colors and reaching up and calling out. The dragonfly leans in as though conversing with the flame of the flower. White-tipped, sparse hairs on the back of its head, amber wings nestled aside, eyes of intent and attention spanning nearly 360 degrees. Images like this connect me to the moment, the meetup, the temporary connection of the three of us. And that is pleasing to me. This great find falls under the category of bizarre. Mav and I were hiking with Linda Gianti at Campbell's Hump State Forest Trails when I noticed a dragonfly on the ground, shaking and shimmering like crazy. So I looked closer. It turns out a bee, right here, had attached himself to the dragonfly and apparently would not let go. The dragonfly ended up flying a little ways and the bee stayed attached. The fly on the left looks to me like he's wearing a COVID mask. The beetle on the right climbed up a grass stalk as I knelt in the meadow. Have you ever climbed a mountain to converse with the wind, or climbed out on a branch of a tree swaying in the breeze? That's what I imagined he felt like. This leaf beetle seems to be tethered with a safety lifeline. When observing insects in our backyard, I sometimes see one fall off a leaf, and I think, ouch, that had to hurt. But they always get up and move on. This one is tethered to a lifeline of support, but there is a serious side to this story. Good timing. There is a serious side to this story. Insects are experiencing global declines in both abundance and diversity. Many species may disappear before we even discover them. This should give us pause. The rusty patch bumblebee was once common across eastern North America. It's not been observed in Vermont since 1999. Preventing further loss will require knowledge, habitat restoration, and new priorities in how we manage land. Please join me in a moment of remembrance as part of this insect memorial.
That's Bernie's dream, to find a rusty patched bumblebee. With one or two remaining.
Excavating a stem to build a new house looks like hard work. This tiny bee is only 5 to 7 millimeters long. I often view them kicking out plant sawdust from last year's plant stems. At the end of the summer season, leave raspberry, blackberry, and goldenrod stems, and next spring you can watch these bees making their home in your yard as well. It's pretty cool to see the sawdust on the leaves. And then I start watching. If you're interested in photographing insects and posting them on iNaturalist, use a fast shutter speed if possible. Fill the frame, and remember, phone cameras work fine. iNaturalist, by the way, is a crowdsourced species identification system and an organism occurrence recording tool. You can use it to record your own observations, get help with identifications, collaborate with others to collect this kind of information for a common purpose, or access the observational data collected by iNaturalist users. I've had scientists from across the country contact me, even though that I've got it noted that anybody can use the pictures anytime they want, but they still contact me as a politeness, I guess, to say, hey, do you mind if we use one of your pictures in research? So it's just a good feeling to know that that's that additional value to having those pictures out there. Now let's take a quick stroll through some more of my favorites. At this Beatlemania concert, I patiently lay on the sand with my teeth starkly juxtaposed to the elephant-like tusk of the beetle on the right. These spotted beetles are not usually common, but they're fun. They scuttle really fast. They're hard to get a picture of. They move quite quickly. Jiminy Cricket's cousin on the right.
Oh, shoot. Now, for some reason, it wants to move at its own speed. I don't know why. Okay.
Jiminy Cricket's cousin on the right, and an ad on the left for Avon lipstick. Deflated. It takes 1 to 2 hours for a dragonfly's wings to fully inflate and dry after emerging from its larval skin. Sounds like me when I get up in the morning. It takes a lot of coffee pumped into my wings. Wing covers up, ready for takeoff. As described in the book, Is a River Alive? Insects call me. They're almost always boring or tunneling or entering something somewhere. And in turn, they invite the same desire to enter deep within if you watch them very closely. To climb into, to fathom life's depths and delve into its core. Nature rewards patience. The longer you watch, the more the story unfolds. The bee on the left is a nomad bee, a kleptoparasite. Kleptoparasites, or cuckoo bees, are insects that do not build their own nests or collect pollen to provision for their young. Instead, they sneak into the nest of another bee species to lay their eggs, allowing their larvae to feed on the food supplies gathered by the host bee species. The host bee, sorry. The female bee on the right seems to be saying, wow, it's so bright up here. The female must have also been reluctant to enter the airspace above, as there were hundreds of males that day flying low to the ground, ready to pounce on any female. I had to lay on the ground for a long time before the bee would finally come out. Caught the red eye last night. Some of nature's paintbrushes have a very fine tip. Here they're used for flair. Buffalo green's my name. It's hard to get respect when you're no bigger than a thumbnail. Still, against a black backdrop, this fellow looks a bit like a tank. collecting pollen for Valentine's Day, but it's Mama carrying the sweet pollen of flowers home, not Dad. We can all enjoy the surprises in nature, even if the target species doesn't make itself available. So why does it matter beyond curiosity? The more we notice, the more we care. And the more we care, the better decisions we make about the landscape around us. When in nature, remember to look up as well as down. Nature isn't somewhere else. It's right outside your door, and it's often at eye level. Before we wrap up, just a brief note about upcoming programs for some of the people that didn't hear earlier, that just came in later. You're all invited to join me and the Underhill Conservation Commission in May, although this isn't the right day. The day is yet to be determined, for a bird and bugs outing at Crane Brook Conservation District at 75 New Hill Road in Underhill. And all New Road, thank you. Also contact us anytime that flowers are in bloom to have us visit your yard for a 1 or 2 hour facilitated bug safari, and we'll post pictures onto iNaturalist and help you understand with the IDs. I invite you to also to learn about other Vermont Entomology Academy programs. Many of them are interactive, and all but one are free. Just visit vtbugeyed, one word, .blogspot.com. And as a reminder, we have a few openings left in the June Youth Bug Camp, running the last week of June, 8 hours a day. Where's the best place to observe insects? Probably right in your own backyard. Earlier I asked you to think about how many bee species and how many insect species might live in a single yard. In our 1 acre yard, I've documented over 100 wild bee species and over 1,000 insect species. All of this biodiversity exists in a space smaller than 2 football fields. If you want to see more pollinators, more fascinating and awe-inspiring insects, the answer isn't to travel farther, it's to look closely. Observe the life happening around you. T.S. Eliot wrote, "And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." Henry David Thoreau wrote, "Nature will bear the closest inspection," and it does. There are more species of insects in a wide range of colors, patterns and sounds and behaviors than one could ever see in total. Some in Vermont as yet to be discovered. Nature isn't somewhere else. It's right outside your back door. Seek moments of wonder and awe, inspired by nature in your everyday life. Nature will reward you. Tonight, I've spoken for the insects and relayed a little of the sensation that I've experienced by merging with them in time and place. Now it's up to you to seek and observe them, to encounter their daily life, and to feel and hear what they say to you. Thank you for attending Backyard Insect Finds, Great Discoveries in Nature. Thank you. Thank you. So as a way of introduction, thank you to the Community Center members, by the way, for caring for this lovely space, making it available to us. And thank you all for joining us for Backyard Insects and Vermont Bees. 2 engaging back-to-back, hopefully engaging, back-to-back presentations on the insects living right outside your door, brought to you by the Vermont Entomology Academy. Next up, is Spencer Hardy, Vermont Center for EcoStudies biologist and co-owner of the Farm Upstream. Spencer helps make it clear that anyone can illuminate the natural world. His collaborative work on the Vermont Wild Bee Atlas shows us exactly what that is like. From nets to microscopes, from field observations to classroom lessons, from obscure bits of insect anatomy to iNaturalist IDs, bee checklists, and research papers. He does it all. Thank you, Spencer, for the work you do at VCE and at the Farm Upstream. And by the way, we love your CSA.
Thank you, Bernie. Can I just steal your, this one stop working?
Yep.
Be there momentarily. Thanks you all for coming out on a snowy day. Thank you, Bernie, for setting the stage. I am going to talk a little bit about my work, mostly with bees, but a little bit of other insects and the plants as well, because it's all tied together, as Bernie clearly articulated. I work for the Vermont Center for the EcoStudies, at least part-time. I've been studying bees with them for 10 years now almost. And the rest of the time now, I co-owner of the Farm Upstream just down the road, growing fruit, vegetables, and native plants. And this is sort of a synthesis of the bee field work and then blending into our work at the Farm Upstream, growing plants to support a lot of these bees that I've been spending time studying. And that work funded by VCE, especially collaboration with Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and then a lot of this is also through the Vermont Pollinator Working Group. And if anyone's interested, I encourage you to check it out. We do an annual public event. It's going to be in June this year in Shelburne, at Shelburne Farms. Sort of everything pollinator, with a focus on backyard biodiversity and things that we can do to make our world more hospitable. Vermont Center for EcoStudies, for anyone that's not familiar, we're a pretty small nonprofit based out of White River Junction. We study everything from balloons to moths to bees. And we have this, I work under the Vermont Atlas of Life, one of our many projects, with the goal of documenting all of the biodiversity of Vermont, in part through iNaturalist, but also through targeted work like I've been doing with bees. And on our online portal, you can type in your favorite species and you can see all kinds of information about where they've been found, when they're likely to be found. And you can see all of Bernie's amazing observations that feed into this portal through iNaturalist. This is the synthesis of the last 5 years of bee work, a monograph on all of the 352 species that we now know of from Vermont. It's just published in November. And you can see the map of Vermont. All of the little tiny dots that you can barely make out are places we have records of bees. A lot of those are from people like you who posting photos to iNaturalist. It's our best way of being all over the state all at once. And then I spend a lot of time trying to fill in the holes and to chase rare and unusual species to know more about them. But all of that is synthesized in this monograph. And then some of these photos or figures are actually from our State of Bees report that's on our website that we put out in 2022, sort of a public-facing synthesis of a lot of our work. This graph, you probably can't read the bottom. The x-axis is the years, going back, I think, to like 1840, all the way up through the present. And the y-axis is the number of species of bees recorded in that year. So, and this is all of the data for bees that we could possibly find for Vermont. We went through all the museum collections, we went through all of the literature, trying to track down as much information as we could. Very little through the 1800s as you'd expect. You start getting a few records in the 1900s. There was a Middlebury professor that did a lot of collecting in the 60s. But really, we don't really know anything about bees in Vermont prior to about 2010, when a lot of this work started, and some work at UVM that happened about the same time. And you can see the skyrocketing number of records just in the last 5 years, 30,000 of which belong to Bernie, but there's a lot more records beyond that from other people and from our work. So why bees? Why am I talking about bees and not crickets or dragonflies or all the other cool insects that are in our backyards? In large part because bees are really important for pollinators and for agricultural systems. So there's some money there, and there's some interest in studying them. These are two examples from our farm last summer. We bought 52 acres in 2023. It had been either, the majority of the open land was either a hayfield or a couple acre mowed lawn. Not a lot of bee diversity. These are two examples of fruit that, as best I can tell, didn't receive enough pollen. So they got some pollination to set. There's some seeds on this melon on one side. The other half didn't get enough pollen for whatever reason. And so the lack of pollination is happening in Vermont, in our communities. There's work out of UVM showing that on some blueberry farms, having better wild bees would add over $100,000 a year in potential profit and productivity of the blueberries. So in some systems, we need more bees, although Vermont is much better positioned than most states in the country. And why bees? Why are bees the best pollinators? Basically, it comes down to these branched hairs. Somewhere on the body of all female bees, they have microscopic hairs with multiple branches, like a split end or like a pipe cleaner. And this is an adaptation to collect pollen. So female bees are, for the most part, not exclusively, for the most part, are gathering pollen to bring back to the nest to feed their young. You can see on this bee here, on a tomatillo flower, all of the pollen grains that are stuck to her hind leg. Lots of other insects you'll see on flowers. Bees are the only ones, at least in the Northeast, that are actively gathering that pollen to move it back to their nest. And along the way, they're spilling some on other flowers and helping to pollinate them. Not to say other insects aren't pollinating, but bees are a little more intentional about it, although they're doing it for their own purposes, not for the flower. And the flower has evolved to benefit from that. Bees are really just picky vegetarian wasps. They're in the same order as, they're in the underneath wasps in the tree of life, order Hymenoptera. But it's this subset that is distinct in that they are feeding their offspring entirely pollen. Other wasps, as Bernie alluded to, are eating grasshoppers or caterpillars, or they're parasitizing beetles, or even eating bees. But bees offspring are developing entirely on plant pollen, as best we can tell. And within Vermont, there's, like I said, 352 species of bees, all with an interesting, unique story that I could go on and on and on about, although we really don't know what a lot of them are doing. But I'm going to highlight a few what I think are fun species that I think are telling of the bee diversity and of why there are things we can do in our backyards to make a difference. Bernie mentioned this one. This is one of my favorites at the moment, the sandbar willow fairy bee. I mean, it's like 3 or 4 millimeters, smaller than a grain of rice. And you're only ever going to find it if you can find sandbar willow, which is one of 20 species of willows that occur in Vermont, 24 species maybe. This one only along some of our bigger rivers in sort of the gravel bars that occur when we get periodic flooding. There's a decent population along the Lee River just downstream of our farm. I have not found the bee there yet, but I suspect it is. No one had found this bee anywhere in New England until we started looking for it. We've since found it at a couple sites where we went specifically looking for sandbar willow when it's blooming in June and July, which is very different from the rest of our willows. All of our other willows are blooming in April and May, and this one species is blooming later in the season and has a really distinct bee fauna associated with it. This is a generalist that many of you are probably familiar with. Maybe one of the most common distinctive bees in Vermont, the tricolored bumblebee. We have 12 or 13 species of bumblebees that are currently in Vermont. Bernie mentioned the rusty patch that hasn't been seen since 1999. We know a fair amount about bumblebees, but just they're out there. They're often distinctive and a good gateway into inverting. They're fairly easy to identify, pretty common, pretty approachable. This one, if you see the red on the middle section like that, it's almost certainly this one species. Whereas a lot of these other bees are more challenging to identify. Another point is that bumblebees are active from basically when the snow melts in April through August or September. And so during that time, they're using a lot of different food sources. So they're generalists, meaning they eat a lot of things. Some of these other bees have much shorter lifespans and are much more focused on one or two plants. But bumblebees are the best example of these generalists that need flowers sort of the whole summer to complete their life cycle. This is a very specialized bee, the cranesbill miner. This one you only find on wild geranium for about 2 weeks in May. In Vermont, it's pretty much limited to sort of the richer part of the Champlain Valley on some of the foothills. But if you find wild geranium growing in a decent abundance, you're potentially going to find this geranium miner, cranesbill miner. Another one that we didn't know was in Vermont until we started looking for it, and one you could find in your garden if you planted wild geranium and waited a couple of years. This one probably won't show up in your yard, only because it's limited to far southwestern Vermont on this funny shrub called maleberry. It's a distant relative of the blueberries, but has a slightly different flower and a dry fruit, but is the only host for 4 species of specialist bees. So far, we've only found one of them in Vermont, but if I lived closer to maleberry populations, I could probably find the other ones.
Maleberry.
Leonia is the genus.
How is it spelled?
M-A-L-E. Lyonia is the... Huckleberry is another name for it. Obscure shrub I would never have heard of if I hadn't been looking for these bees. And then, so the majority of the bees in Vermont the females are collecting pollen, bringing it back to their nest, leaving basically a pollen loaf that they're laying an egg on for the next generation. But almost 25% of our species do it a little differently in that they're finding the nests of other bees and laying their eggs on the loafs that the host species collects. So if people are familiar with cowbirds, very similar story where they're finding nests of the host bee, laying an egg, and then leaving that egg to develop on its own on the resources that the host species collected. This is the least cellophane cuckoo. This one happens to be laying its eggs on Banks's cellophane bee, which is a specialist on winterberry holly. So the host bee is collecting winterberry pollen, burying it in sandy soils. This bee is coming along, laying its egg, and the larvae are developing on that winterberry pollen. Very rare. This is the only location we know of it for all of New England, in Colchester. This one is parasitizing a sunflower specialist. So there's a couple of bees that only use sunflower pollen, especially the wild sunflowers, and this bee comes along and tries to take over those nests. And then I'll get a few more similar stories, but from the nesting angle. So bees need flowers. Breadth of diversity of host plants and phenology and what they're using and how they're interacting with the plants. But and then on the nesting side, there's a similar diversity of lifestyles. Most of them are nesting in the ground, in holes, and particularly in sandy soils. But something like 15% are nesting in above ground cavities. Bernie had a picture of the small carpenter bee disappearing into a hole. This is what the larvae look like inside of that stalk. Probably the most abundant bee in almost everyone's backyard if you have a little bit of messy habitat. This bee is nesting under the Route 2A bridge in Essex, where there's a eroding clay bank that's protected from the rain, and this bee is able to make these elaborate structures. This one nests in rotting logs, primarily hardwoods, but also I've seen them in maple stumps. I've seen them in even dead snags where the top is rotted off. You find a lot of these pure green sweat bees. This is one you'll probably see in your yard once you start next summer when things warm up and you're paying a little bit of attention. And these green bees are quite common on a variety of flowers, but they need large woody debris nearby to nest, which Vermont has a lot of. This one was nesting in a piece of firewood where I drilled a hole on a porch in downtown Montpelier. They probably, in the wild, they're probably nesting in old beetle holes and snags. They're not drilling their own hole, but they're finding cavities in dead wood and are putting their pollen and nests in there. This one was nesting at the edge of a driveway at a different apartment in Montpelier. Kept parking on top of them all fall, and I didn't have anywhere else to park, but I was worried what I was doing to the nests. And then like 6 months later, this paper came out showing that the nests are actually 3 feet underground. So they're digging this tunnel. This bee is, I mean, this one's pretty big, maybe honeybee sized, a centimeter. But it's digging a 3-foot tunnel down into the sand, building a little chamber and putting all its pollen down, probably multiple trips of pollen down to that hole, making this loaf, laying an egg. And then that bee's seals off the chamber, will never meet its offspring. But the following August, the larva chews its way out of the ground and knows to go collect pollen from asters and goldenrod in this case. So this is a goldenrod, mostly an aster specialist, that is only active as an adult for the month of September, basically. The rest of the year it's underground and living a full year and then dying and hoping that the eggs that it have laid underground are able to come back the next summer. And then this is a mining bee here. It's got a bunch of pollen on its leg going down into a hole. And then this red thing here is one of the cuckoo bees that's waiting for a chance to go into that same hole and lay its egg on that pollen loaf that the host is collecting for it. Everyone's favorite bee. Everybody knows something about honeybees. Are there any beekeepers in the room? Honeybees have gotten a lot of attention. They sort of were the impetus that started people worrying about colonies collapse disorder and the insect apocalypse and the potential impacts on agriculture. And certainly a lot of that is really valid. It's become much harder to keep honeybees alive. But honeybees themselves are not in any risk of going extinct. They're not an endangered species. They're not even a native species in North America. They were domesticated in Eastern Europe, brought over probably 1600s, have been in the United States ever since. But they're a major part of our agricultural systems. Things like almonds wouldn't exist without honeybees. Almond production at scale in conventional, chemical-dependent orchards that are like much of the Central Valley of California. Interesting figure here showing the number of honeybee hives per decade going back. I think so. The first decade of 2000s versus the second. There's actually more hives in the United States in the second 10 years of this century. But the hexagons at the top are the number of pounds of honey per hive produced. And that's declining, which is an indication that the health of these hives is declining. Part of that's due to a mite that spreads a lot of diseases among honeybees. Part of it's probably due to lack of available resources on the landscape. There's a lot of diseases that are spreading among honeybees and then also into wild bees. So people think they're getting honeybee hives to save the bees and to help pollination, and I don't recommend it as a way to do something to help this biodiversity crisis. It's the only way to produce honey. It's important if you're growing acres and acres and acres of pollinator-dependent crops without wild pollinators nearby. But in terms of supporting wild ecosystems and supporting wild pollinators, it's probably detrimental and neutral at best. So part of the State of Bees report, we came up with some things that the state and conservationists and landowners of all sorts and can do to support bees within our state and to start to make some change at the declines that we've seen. The areas on blue on this map we've highlighted as important bee areas. So these are areas in the state that we think have particularly high diversity and abundance of native wild bees, especially rare species. And if you know your Vermont geography very well, a lot of these areas are the lower reaches of major rivers. You got the Winooski, the Lamoille, the Missisquoi, the White, the Black. Rivers move a lot of sand, rivers move a lot of earth. A lot of that gets filtered out as sand deposits. Sand is a lot easier to dig in than other soil types. Most of the bees are nesting in the ground. They like to be able to dig into these sandy soils. They also drain much better, so there's less risk of fungal development. It's just a nicer place to live than in a hard-packed clay that's soggy for half the year. So we find best indicator of bee diversity is the sandy soils. A lot of it's, not all of it, but a lot of it's along these major rivers. And then we also identified 7 habitats that have unique bee assemblages. I won't go into them all here, except other than we're going to talk a little bit about gardens and farms. And community gardens in particular are one of my favorite spots to go look for unusual bees. You've got a lot of people growing a lot of different things. There's flowers all the time. There are often some messy parts. They're not getting, for the most part, not getting a lot of chemicals. They're not getting tilled very often. You've got, just a nice mix of flowers and plant material for nesting. And it's an open area that maybe not the most natural landscape, but one of the best for bee diversity, often on nice soils too for nesting. And just a couple examples of the spectrum of what backyards can look like, and we can speculate as to the bee diversity of a close mowed lawn, not even a clover blooming. If you're lucky, maybe there's a couple things nesting in that 2 acres, but very little bee activity. A more traditional garden full of all our favorite cultivars, bee balm and gooseneck loosestrife and phlox, and certainly be some bees in there. Most of what you'd find would be generalists, bumblebees and carpenter bees, things that aren't super picky about what they're eating. Some hummingbirds probably. But if you swap out that the red scarlet bee balm for our native wild bergamot, the purple, basically the same plant except it's a different flower and it evolved in this part of the country. Then all of a sudden you get the bee balm short-faced bee, tiny little black bee that is only found on wild bergamot. And you could do that with any one of these. You switch the white gooseneck loosestrife with one of our native yellow loosestrifes, and you potentially get 2 or 3 species of oil-collecting loosestrife bees, which are among some of the rarest in the state. And on and on and on. By choosing the plants that evolved in this part of the world, we can attract the bees that have evolved here and that are still here. And then another example with our sunflowers at the top. The one on the left is a variety that's bred to not have any pollen, which is great for your table, less of a mess to pick up, but the pollen is the reason that most of these bees are going to flowers. Maybe there's some nectar on there. You might find a few bumblebees every once in a while, but basically that's a useless plant from the bee perspective. The middle is also a sunflower cultivar of the annual sunflower, not a native species to Vermont, but a native genus and a native North American, I think the annual sunflower is a native North American species, but it has pollen on it. There's some sunflower bees that'll show up on that, gathering that pollen, and a bunch of generalists. But better yet, if you can find the native perennial sunflower, A, you don't have to plant it every year, and B, it's the one that evolved with our local pollinators and is more likely, and tracks some of these specialists that maybe you don't find on the annual sunflower. A partial plant list. There's a lot of other plant lists out there. These are some of my favorites, and once again I'll emphasize trees and shrubs is a good way to get a lot of plants in a small space without replanting every year. And then the bold doesn't show up super well, but all the species in bold have at least one specialist bee associated with them. So you plant blueberries and there's 3 or 4 species that you might get. Willows have 6. Even staghorn sumac has a specialist bee. And then the flame sumac, or the shining sumac, which is barely in Vermont, but it's available commercially a few places, that has a specialist bee on it as well, different from the staghorn sumac specialist. I can come back to this if people want to take notes, but one last comment before we go to any questions. People, there's a new growing trend of selling mason bees, and people may be familiar with them they're these small, really fuzzy, some of them are native, and they're really good at pollinating early spring apples and blueberries, and you can buy them online now. ostensibly for increasing the pollination of your backyard. You buy, I don't know, you get 30 or 40 of them in cocoons, you put them out in the spring, and they're supposed to go nest in your backyard and then pollinate all your fruit trees. And you can also buy these bee hotels that they can nest in. The bee hotels are fine, and I think there's value there, but really would discourage people from buying the bees themselves because they're coming often from the western U.S. You don't really know what's going to be inside that cocoon. There's a couple species of fungus that'll eat them. There's parasitic wasps. There's other parasitic bees. There's a long list of things that could be inside that cocoon that you're buying that could then emerge into the landscape and spread to our native mason bees. And there's a good chance that you're going to get this lovely horn-faced mason, which is actually a Japanese species that the USDA thought was good to introduce for pollination of cherries in the 70s. It's now all over the country, and there's some pretty compelling evidence that as it spreads into new areas, the native mason bee populations decline. It's very aggressive, and once you have it, you'll start seeing it everywhere for a few weeks in the spring. They also really like to nest inside of underneath clapboards in houses and garages, and like old nail holes in barns. It's doing a good job at what it does, but is causing issues for our native species. Better off to install the habitat than to buy the bees and hope that they stick around your yard. And I'm happy to chat for a while, stick around with questions after people need to head out.
With like agriculture as such, is it at a point where like, excuse me, like we need to like bring in the honeybee? Like, are the honeybees so good at being generalists that, like, so say you wanted to have zero pollination problems, like your melon or zucchini pictures, are the wild bees too like specific to the crops that they want, where purely relying on them might not necessarily like be able to accomplish all of our agricultural goals?
For the most part, there's a lot. 75% of the species of bees, the native species, are generalists, so they're likely to be visiting a wide range of things. In the cases of the squash, we actually have a squash specialist that only visits zucchini and winter squash, and does a great job pollinating that. There's maybe a few cases where honeybees are commercially viable or commercially beneficial in Vermont. If you get really large orchards where there's a large bloom for a short period of time, and then the rest of the season there's not a lot of other resources, our generalist bees aren't really able to survive there beyond the mass bloom event. So an apple orchard that's got an understory of dirt or sod, it's going to need a lot of bees for a short period of time. And then there's no apple specialists, and all of our generalist bees need other food, and they can only travel 300 or 400 yards from their nest. So unless you have nesting habitat inside your orchard and other wild habitat or other flowers available.
I wanted to put a little perspective on that, because really what we're talking about is a little bit of a scalability consideration, in that Vermont is not Nebraska, where we're talking about our native and formerly our global food supply. So when we're seeing 10,000 acres dying off because of application of neonicotinoids by the neighbor, then yeah, we've got not just an issue of the honeybees surviving, but an issue of restocking with the pollinators that were just removed. But here locally, as he's describing, everything's kind of compartmentalized.
If we didn't have honeybees, we would have no almonds, and large-scale agriculture of almonds, blueberries, cherries, all these things that are pollen dependent just wouldn't exist, because we're moving honeybees to these crops as they bloom, putting them out there for a few weeks, and they're doing almost all the pollination services of a 1,000-acre almond orchard without a single other flower that blooms in February before the native bees really get going.
And then my follow-up question is just that, like, does the honeybee, you mentioned maybe it's possibly detrimental to some notion of like, was that without competing the native bees to an extent that could cause their populations to decline? Yeah,
so there's a potential issue of competition. It's an active area of research. I don't know the ins and outs of the latest work, but potential for competition. A honeybee hive probably uses the same amount of pollen as 100,000 native bees. And if there's most landscapes, there's a limiting amount of pollen. Things that are good for honeybees are also good for native bees, and that there's more flowers on the landscape. But and then the big one that I'm concerned about is disease spread from these mites, there's a half dozen viruses and bacteria that are pretty common in honeybee hives that also affect wild bees. The extent of that, I think, is not well documented and probably depends on the scale and the situation. And again, the scariest ones are the tractor trailers of trucks of honeybees that are coming from California, then they go to Georgia, and then they go to Florida to pollinate citrus or blueberries, and then they come to Vermont for the summer, and they're let out onto our landscape to recover and to feed on our wildflowers. And they're bringing all those things with them from all these other hives.
Oh, that's happening?
Yeah, so the pollination industry is huge, and people are paying good money to have bees brought into their almond orchards, and then those bees need a place to go, and they go up to Washington State, they pollinate cherries, they've got a mission in for blueberries, and then Vermont's a nice place for them to spend the summer because we've got a lot of flowers. So after they're needed for pollinating of these crops, they're often 14,000 hives were brought to Vermont in 2022 is the only data that I have for the summer. And then they take them back, and then in February they probably go to the south in November when it gets cold, and then they go to California for the February for the almond bloom.
So they're working year round, they don't go to sleep.
Right, so
Spencer, you mentioned sandy soil a lot and the benefits or the need for sandy soil. If you don't, and I think there was one slide that maybe showed a winterberry, and you said something. So are we doing a disservice to bees having winterberry shrubs but no sandy soil around?
no, it's an interesting question. You just probably won't get, so the winterberry specialist is dependent on sandy soils. We have a lot of winterberry in Vermont. We only know of this bee from like 2 sites in Colchester where it happens to grow next to sand. So I don't think there's any detriment. You just won't get this bee, or if it won't stick around. But there's other bees that'll use winterberry and then nest in above ground cavities or other sites. So yeah, some of these specialists, they need both. Having one, I don't think is detrimental. If that makes sense.
Is there much research being done on moths as pollinators in Vermont?
I don't know of any Vermont specific stuff, but I've seen a lot recently of some new studies, people putting cameras out at night, and there's, like in commercial blackberry farms, there's more moth pollination than there is anything else during the day. And I think we haven't really even touched the iceberg of that one.
Paper wasps and hornets, like the ones that like to nest in our house and sting us when we get close. Are those, where do they fit in as pollinators?
Primarily, they're going after other insects, so they're good generalist predators of caterpillars and sawflies and the things that we don't like in our garden. They will visit flowers for nectar, and I've actually some of the yellow jacket species I think are actually some of the better pollinators, or the more common pollinators at least, of fall blooming raspberries. So if you have raspberries that don't start blooming till August, for whatever reason, the yellow jackets are the ones that I see on there the most. They're more beneficial as a pest control than as pollinators, and certainly don't need to get stung by them.
Paper wasps come back. I have a paper wasp in the tree near my house. Will they come back to the same nest?
One of the like big football things.
Yeah.
I believe not. I believe they've left it for the winter,
Right.
and they'll build a new one next year, somewhere
Near
else.
it or where?
Somewhere else. I don't think right next to it, but
We
I don't
had
know where.
winter wasps this year and yellow jackets, and we didn't have a single potato bug. I picked up one striped cucumber beetle. I really think that those carnivorous insects were taking care of our garden pests. It was the first year ever. We didn't have any. We didn't have any squash beetles. We didn't have,
Lucky you.
I know, it was wonderful.
Spencer, you mentioned riverine environments with the sand deposition. What role are forests playing in, aside from providing habitat overwintering and stuff, but what role do forests flowers play in supporting
Yeah.
native bees?
Anyone spent a lot of time in a hardwood forest, there's a ton of flowers for the month of April. The leaves come out, becomes shady and dark, and all of a sudden there's nothing blooming. It's the same way with the bees. So there's, I don't know, a dozen species that are really only found in hardwood forests for that 1 month. So there's a specialist on trout lily, there's a specialist on spring beauty, there's a specialist on Virginia waterleaf. And then as soon as the canopy closes, there's no sun, it's cool and dark, the flower activity just dies down. It's really hard to find bees for most of the summer in these hardwood forests. They're there, they're just all underground as larvae. And then remnant forests and like hard strips of trees and scrubs are the best nesting places for bumblebees and for a lot of our other generalist bees that are going to be active in the summer.
Probably a tough question, but do we have, not to put one bee over another, but do we have an idea of any particular species of solitary bee that is the most efficient pollinator? And I realize you could play around with that word efficient, but and if there is, how do we know that?
From a commercial agriculture standpoint, if I had to have only one bee, it would be some species of bumblebee. They're active all season, they visit a lot of flowers. They do what's called buzz pollinating, where they actually grab certain plants and they vibrate their wings at a frequency that the plants know to release their pollen. It's like a static electrical charge that they release their pollen onto the bee. Honeybees can't do this. Some of our solitary bees can do it, but not all of them. But bumblebees are really good at it. So they're the most efficient pollinators of blueberries because they're able to do that. Honeybees will pollinate blueberries, but you need to like dump thousands of them on them and eventually they get a little bit of pollination service. Whereas bumblebees are much more efficient because they're able to basically tell the plants to release their pollen. Same thing with tomatoes, although they're not super pollen dependent. Yeah, so I mean, you can buy bumblebees now to bring into your greenhouse to pollinate tomatoes or cucumbers or something if you're screening out all the other insects, or buy them for your blueberry orchard if you don't think you have enough wild pollination. But we've got a lot of bumblebees and they're pretty good at pollinating most of our, there's a few crops they maybe don't go to, but for the most part they're there and they're doing a lot of the work. One question back here and then.
Are carpenter bees also important for pollination?
The small carpenter bee, I think, there's the little small carpenter bee that Bernie had pictures of excavating the holes. Those are probably great pollinators of some systems. They're not as generalized as bumblebees. And then there's how many people know the large carpenter bee? The big one with the white face that gets in your face, sort of aggressive, and that actually wasn't in Vermont until 2005, maybe the first record. It's a southern species that's moved north as things have warmed and is fond of nesting in old barns. A good pollinator of some plants. Generally not people's favorite bee, but kind of fun to watch. Jane,
I just want to comment on the bringing bumblebees in, buying them. I wouldn't, we used to on our farm, and we don't anymore. It's really not recommended. There's getting to be a little bit better disease monitor of the bees that come in, but they're mostly coming from Europe. The breeding work was done with American, U.S. Bumblebees brought over to mostly Dutch breeding work, did the work, and then sending them back. But in the meantime, picked up a bunch of diseases, issues, and it was kind of, so now they have this an occasional testing, but so if you get the one that got tested, yay. So anyway, if you're thinking about getting bumblebees, I would say probably just create habitat and get the natural native bees that are already here.
absolutely. So that's the reason why we lost the rusty patch bumblebee, as best we can tell, is that it picked up a gut parasite. The bumblebees bred in Europe picked up a gut parasite that brought back here that escaped, and was some of our native species were really vulnerable to. I think they're all bred in the U.S. now, mostly out of Michigan. It's a little bit regulated, but and compared to the mason bees, it's there's at least a little more attention paid to it. But yes, there's a few systems if you're trying to grow perfect cucumbers in a tunnel and not have and screen out all the other insects, and you need pollination. there's valid horticultural reasons to bring in honeybees or bumblebees, but certainly not something for the average backyard. And even there's other ways to do it on farms too, I think.
I have a question on plants. If you buy a plant that's developed like in South Carolina that's in zone 4, I guess, or 5, bring it up to zone 3, do the bumblebees here know what to do with it?
That's a really interesting question, and actually a project that some colleagues at the Vermont Center for EcoStudies are actively working on. So they took 12 species of native plants. They took seeds from the southeast, the Midwest, and the Northeast, and then grew them all side by side in Vermont. And this is the second year of monitoring what bees and caterpillars and other insects are visiting them. And the preliminary data is showing that for some species, there's different bee assemblages. Different bees are visiting we call them the local ecotype, which are the ones that are evolved here. And in part because of phenology. So Golden Alexander from North Carolina is going to bloom at a different time than the Golden Alexander from Washington County, Vermont. And there's a Golden Alexander specialist bee that comes out to time itself with the Golden Alexander that evolved here. So it might miss the one from South Carolina or from Indiana. There are probably going to be other generalist bees that are active already and will visit the other ecotypes. But the closer you can get to the local wild ecotype of these species, the more likely you are to sync up with the native species.
And that phenology carries is not just that year. So if you bought the plant in North Carolina and it's a perennial and it comes back, it's still going to have the phenology that doesn't match the bee.
Yeah, I was thinking of like looking at, what I'm going to plant next year in my garden, like a knockout rose, which is North Carolina, I think. It'll die in the wintertime. But with global warming, it might stick around.
Assisted migration.
And how long will it take the bees to adjust to it, like learning to eat Chinese food or whatever?
Plenty of species, bumblebees included, that'll visit any flower in front of them that looks like a flower.
Make a point on the whole global warming and shifting of plants because it's a huge subject matter. But if you're ever over at the library on the center, you take a look and wonder why one of those trees just shoots straight up, and you'll find that Don Toby put a tulip poplar in there without anyone telling anyone he did it.
Right, so in 100 years, we're going to have a climate of Western Pennsylvania or something, and there's an argument to be made for bringing up those plants that evolved there.
So these guys get used to it.
Hard to know. That the timelines are really different. Evolution versus, yeah. But it's an interesting rabbit hole to go down.
Other questions?
I'm happy to stick around afterwards. There's some pinned dead bees in the box on the back table if anyone wants to see something that's not snow.
3 quick comments. Thank you, Verity, and Mount Mansfield TV for recording tonight. We appreciate it. 2, Nathan reminded me, remember that, especially if there's any birders here, that inverting is the new birding. We hope to see it grow as much as birding did. This wood carving that I mentioned, Terry Healy, who's back here, lives in Jericho, and he carved this beautiful butterfly on this piece of ash.
That's ash that was grown and milled by Schulman's, and they gave me the wood to mess around with, and so I wanted to pay them back.
Beautiful piece of work. And what else? If you're interested in the website, please take a card. Besides the Vermont Entomology Academy programs, there's a whole ton of other stuff that I continually post out there, so take it for reference. And thank you all again for coming. Yes, question?
It's just an announcement, actually. Bernie and Mav are going to be at the Deborah Rothman Library on March 3rd at 5:30, sharing how to use Naturalist, iNaturalist, and other sites for identification, and learning a little bit about Mav's writing life and with birds. So that's coming up. supported by the Deborah Rawson Library and the Underhill Conservation Commission.
Speaking of the Underhill Conservation Commission, I'm with the Jericho Energy Task Force, among other things, and we are having a presentation at the Deborah Rawson in, I think, March. It'll be posted up on Front Porch Forum, but it's Rob Kidd from the Sierra Club, and he's bringing in someone from, I think, VNRS to talk about the global shift on a local basis.
One last commercial. Mav's published 5 books, including Just a Simple Love Affair and the soon-to-be-released in a week or two, Sagebrush Sojourn.
I didn't choose that name.
Good books.
And while we're on it, one more shameless plug. We, in conjunction with Toby from Bird and Bee Native Plants, with the Farm Upstream, is launching a pilot year of a plant CSA. So pay up front, you get a discount, and you get a selection of these and other plants this coming summer.
And they work, because one of the plants, as I mentioned in the slideshow, right, is I said, I really got to get this bee, Spencer. How can I get this bee? He said, plant this plant. So I planted it, and I figured a couple years down the road I'd get the bee. I got the bee the same year. So they just about come with a guarantee.
Is that what the QR code is?
No, this is resources for plant lists. and
Where's
stuff.
this on?
This is the Vermont Center for EcoStudies website. There's a more elaborate plant list. This was a hodgepodge of a couple different lists that I put together. Doesn't exist anywhere else, but
Can we grow American chestnuts now?
with hybridization and/or they're not the same ones that were here, but there's a American chestnut specialist that was once in Vermont on all of our American chestnut. Has never actually been found here, but it's in Massachusetts still, where
Is it Asian that they blended in?
there's some Chinese hybrids, and the bees don't seem to mind.
Oh, I just want to tell people, if you want to see bees nesting in sand, go up to the Jericho, the UVM Jericho Research Forest. When we were there, April, May, Bernie? Hundreds, right next to the buildings, literally hundreds, 500 to 1,000 bees, all mostly the males, and then the little females would peek their heads up and duck back down again. Really fun to watch.
Also, the Richmond Park, volunteer park,
Particularly after a flood.
after that flood brought in a lot of sand.
Yeah.
And I've been watching bees for a couple of years now. And by the way, you probably should mention that these solitary bees, males, first of all, any bumblebees, etc., males can't sting. Secondly, almost all the Vermont bees, bumblebees aside, if they did sting, it's very unusual, but it would be less than a mosquito bite for almost all of them. I mean, it's really not noticeable. So, and I've been, had my face down inches away because I use a macro lens. I have to get very close to bees for the past 6 years, and even some pretty aggressive hornets, the black hornet. Anyway, I've not yet crossed my fingers, but I mean, I've not yet been stung. So for the most part, bees are they're grocery shopping. They're not interested unless you swat them or pick them up or they get stuck under your clothes or something. Typically when people get stung, it's usually a wasp, I think. So that's just another plug for looking close and don't being too weary of them.